Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Reinsurance Podcast. I am your co-host, Jerad Lee.
And I'm Ben Rose, and we're not alone.
We're not.
No, we wouldn't dare enter this very happy new year without bringing along Tom Spire, who has been out in Leadenhall Market and every other country around the world's equivalent over the past 4 months, tracking the renewals and spending a lot of time on planes. Very unenvironmentally friendly. Welcome to the podcast, Tom.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Good to have you back.
As Ben alluded to, today is the deep dive into the 1/1 sort of renewal reports. Some are come out. I've got props.
I was going to say, I just saw you swimming in paper. But.
Again, not environmentally friendly. But we've got the reports have come out from the big brokers. Howden and Gallagher have put theirs out. Aon and GC are alluding to theirs probably over the next couple of weeks. Tons to unpack here. Where do you guys want to start with the 1/1 recaps?
We should probably go super high level first of all. I mean, for those of you who haven't been listening to our coverage, we've mentioned the word orderly about 1 million times, right back from Monte Carlo to Baden-Baden editions of this podcast. But did we achieve that orderly aim, do you think, Tom, when it came to the 1st of January?
I think everybody's claiming that their predictions came true.
Yeah.
And it was more orderly than last year, certainly.
Yeah.
I think it was obvious that it was going to work out that way. I think the interesting things are actually in some of the nuances between the reports.
Yeah, one of the things we'd mentioned in the build-up was this perception that it was going to be like bifurcated across the market. And I think that was one of the themes or a motif that has come out of the reports, is it's used quite heavily across all of them around if risks were not, there's some sort of low losses to certain portfolios or certain layers, those performed really well, sometimes even getting decreases in rate. But those who got hit with losses sort of were taking rate again. But on the whole, the market sort of broadly flat, broadly consistent. But then as you drill into specific lines of business, specific clients, specific geographies or products, then that nuance began to really emerge.
Yeah, and we'll try and dig into each of those sectors during today's episode. We, as usual, don't have a particular plan or structure or order, so you just have to listen to the whole thing if you want to hear all of the insights. But I agree with you both. I think we saw at a high level a real all-round intention from everybody, cedents, brokers, reinsurers alike, to make sure that this felt like a good and friendly and well-managed renewals, partly because, the strain the relationships were put under last year, trying to, get in very quickly a lot of changes that were a little bit uncomfortable. I think this year it was almost about, from the reinsurer's point of view, can we make sure those changes stick? Mm-hmm. From the cedent's point of view, can we make sure they don't get any worse? And from the brokers, can we make sure that it feels like the renewal was smooth? Yeah. So collectively, that intention has probably resulted all round in renewals getting done with roughly the same terms that they had last year, but with some variation, as we should probably dive into.
Yeah, I think that's setting the tone really nicely. If you looked at the sort of prop cat as an example, last year was like a 37% average rate hike. Like, that's savage, right? And everyone sort of felt that. This year it was more like 3. So, and that was just that property cat space, more North American impacted. The other thing that I think is playing a huge role for this renewal season was changes last year moved reinsurers away from aggregation losses. And so, as you were sort of talking, we've talked about on the in the build-up and this sort of these gray swan events. We still hit $100 billion in industry losses, but there was no significant single cat event. But because of the changes in 2023, it meant that the insurers held most of those sort of accumulation losses on their own balance sheets, which meant the reinsurers' performance was in a better position going into this renewal season, which I think you saw driving the sort of capacity play.
Yeah, I think certainly one of the things that remains to be seen how it will play out is what will happen to these so-called secondary perils, right? So the reinsurers have effectively put up their arms and said, no thanks, we're not taking those on anymore. And the insurers have had to say, well, I guess we'll just have to hope they don't happen. And some pockets of the market are more able to deal with that than others. I think in particular, some of the cedents in the Midwest have been struggling, where those are perils they really can't afford to hold on to. But if there's no reinsurers to come and take on those risks, what can you do? There's not really many other sources. We've not seen new capacity coming to the market in any big way. We've seen, yes, a greater adoption of cat bonds than in prior years, but in general, investors have still remained pretty wary about putting new funds into the space. Yes, we've had one good year of results, but perhaps not enough of a track record yet to really inspire new capacity.
Yeah. That diversification in markets, particularly from the clients that I've been talking to, has typically come at the top of towers as well. So you're still seeing an increase in attachment points. You're still seeing all of those frustrations from the beginning of the year. But yeah, where extra capacity has come in, it's tended to be right at the top of those programs.
Yeah, well, and if people want to dive into that more specifically, you have got a great article on that will be linked in the show notes. So those who want to dig in deeper can find that there. But yeah, you're exactly right. And the same thing is you're seeing with the new sources of capacity. Cat bonds grew significantly in this renewal season, partly because they're being deployed on those higher layers. You're seeing an influx of capacity there, but those lower layers and sort of how people navigate those. And again, this is beginning to expose that bifurcation that people have been talking about. Is here it's overflowing in capital and people are oversubscribing, and Tom Wakefield had some points around the sort of psychology of oversubscription in those areas, but sort of while simultaneously running away from still these lower layer attritional sort of exposed layers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, that's the other thing that I was going to mention is, we're sitting here saying the renewal was orderly and everything went smoothly, and we read broker reports that, obviously brokers want to say we did a great job and everything went smoothly. We have clients in places like Italy and Turkey. It didn't go smoothly. Yeah. It was horrible for some clients there. So, definitely a mix.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've also seen with that oversubscription opportunity in some areas, I contrasted with other parts of the market that, as we said, have really struggled. The capacity has not been coming in at the right places for the cedants where it has come in, right? So you've ended up with a retro market, which last year really struggled. Obviously, it came to right at the end of the season when we found out whether there would be enough retro capacity to support the market. This year, because retro actually is quite a small market in itself, any new capacity there actually makes a really big difference quite quickly on. So we've suddenly had, let's say 500 million of new capacity appear there. Wow, suddenly that's a massive change to what that market can do, relatively speaking. Whereas if you were to add 500 million to the more broad traditional reinsurance market, drop in the ocean, nobody cares. We've not been able to see that kind of availability of lower layer capacity that could actually make a difference, a meaningful difference at least, to any rate increase, any rates. And at the same time, probably most of the willingness or loosening of capacity has actually been with those big traditional players who are already in the space and are going to deploy that very selectively to the clients they like best.
Yeah, the other thing that was sort of a theme there was in developments for losses like Ian, which were improving. So then what was last year's renewal season, especially in retro, like trapped capacity, is becoming sort of untrapped, if that's the way you'd frame it. But released capacity is probably a better way.
I like untrapped.
I am untrapping you, caged animal. But that came back in the market. Those investors, there was a renewed appetite to deploy more capital alongside their released capacity sort of from those developments, which again, as that all sort of accumulated, was a better position for the retro space, which then sort of trickled through the reinsurance market a bit, which I think helped.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've seen it interestingly. On one hand, and I think going back to Monte Carlo, property was kind of in the spotlight and everyone was talking about property, and then you've seen hurricanes near miss, and you've seen these releases and so on. That mean that property's actually become a bit more manageable. Everyone's got comfortable with it, whilst at the same time, actually, some of the reserves for casualty have started to look a bit more alarming, and there's been a bit more of a focus there. At the same time, as this capacity crunch that we've been talking about generally, meaning that I think a lot of commissions have come under quite a bit of strain. We haven't seen maybe enough pressure to really affect broader terms beyond last year's changes, or to see really big movements in structures, etc. But what we have seen come under pressure is those commissions, and I think cedents have been pretty willing to give up those to protect their programs more generally.
But do you think casualty was as bad this renewal as, you know, people were talking about? I remember, you know, we were together in Baden-Baden recording, and like, people were getting seriously worried about it, that it was going to be a very, very difficult renewal season for US casualty. And I don't think that's the timing has quite worked out that it's hit this renewal period.
More to come, perhaps, as we move forward into 2024?
Well, possibly. And if that's a big driver of squeezes on commissions, then I think we're going to see that as a trend moving forward.
One of the other things that had come out in the reports related to casualty specifically was there was a real difficulty in changing structures around that. So most of that business is being written on a quota share basis, with the only sort of lever you can pull being the ceding commissions. So what that might look like over time, a real difficulty in moving those to any XL towers or similar. So yeah, as we go into that, there's still that concern around capital and what that might look like in a casualty like event. So yeah, that could be an interesting one. If we don't think if that particular part of the market doesn't seem like it's taken the rate that other parts have, it might be one that sort of is again looming as we go into 2024.
All the same, I guess one of the things that keeps coming back when I've been talking with people around the market is this continued dominance of US property as a class, which is making pretty much anything else attractive as a diversifier in its own right. So whether we can put casualty in that bucket is a bit questionable, but certainly some other markets, say specialty classes that even aren't that profitable, other regions, Europe in particular, becoming maybe a bit more competitive despite not great performance there, just because, you know, people want to load up on all this property and they need something else to balance it with. In a world, in a geopolitical context where actually outside of sort of core, stable, largely Western markets and a few more mature markets in the East, we're seeing a lot of areas where insurers are actually trying to draw back from at the moment because of a lot of issues around the world right now.
Yeah, some of the reports specifically highlighted that U.S. casualty no longer was that trading card that they could swap out to sort of balance that exposure the way it used to be. So for a couple decades, it was very much this, I have a ton of U.S. cat or, and property risk. I can balance that out. I can bring in this casualty to sort of offset some of that. It's no longer looking like that's as appealing for that as that sort of tool, which again adds complexity to these negotiations quite a lot.
Yeah, which leaves you questioning, where do you turn to as you're, you know, if you want to load up on all this new risk, where do you turn to? Especially, actually, we should probably stay on the US for a moment, because quite a few rumblings as we go into, 16, 17, that maybe some of the markets out in the US, hurricane-driven side of things could be improving slightly. So with the assignment of benefits reforms taking place, actually quite a few reinsurers have stepped forwards and said, Florida's now a relatively attractive market again. So yet another source of US premiums that need diversifying with something else at some point.
Yeah, well, and certainly in response to last year where people were sort of fleeing some of those, there's a massive exodus from Florida from some carriers and things, and the reinsurers also sort of looking to avoid that as a class. I think these reforms were necessary to ensure enough capital's coming in to support these different areas. So, it's going to be interesting to see what that looks like coming into the summer.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
What about California wildfire? Do you see that going the same way? Like, there's talk of reforms and legislation.
I don't think we're there yet, to be honest. No, I agree that that's probably the next most important topic for us to come on to in that wider US market, is what on earth is going on in California, and how will they get themselves out of the situation they're in. If you haven't been following that one carefully, right now, a lot of rules prevent the local insurers in California from raising their prices at any given pace. It takes a very long time to get any changes to their prices put forwards, even when new exposures like wildfire come in. There has been a bit of progress on that recently, but in the meantime, most of the reinsurers who were supporting that market have sort of left, and as a result, a lot of the main carriers who were offering policies in that market have said, well, sorry, we can't offer any insurance in that market either, leaving a lot of people in the state of California without access to insurance providers, which is a bit scary given the level of peril.
And it's
in
not
that
much
state.
of a choice either. Like, you know, at least like if there are insurers willing to offer policies, you have a choice between expensive insurance or no insurance.
Yeah.
And they're left with the only choice being no insurance.
Yeah.
You know, that can't be good for anybody.
No, absolutely. And I think it ties into a lot of concern about broadly a few peak peril markets becoming uninsurable if the reinsurance markets won't support them. So how will we, you know, bring capacity to those areas kind of remains to be seen unless we can, you know, get the prices up for the underlying risk in the first place.
Or you're going to continue to have it where there's reinsurance coverage at very high levels, but the insurers have to sort of absorb significant underlying losses before they can get some additional protection. So what that might look like, and the insurers having to build a proposition that allows them to sort of have that level of net retention, I guess, of their losses.
Well, if they have to, right? I think one of the things we've seen over the last year is this growth in the excess and surplus lines market in the US, kind of against admitted carriers, because admitted carriers are very restrained in how they can adjust, particularly deductibles, as a response to inflationary pressure, whereas the E&S market doesn't have that pressure. And actually, that because they're able to pass a bit more of that risk on, share a bit more of that risk, I should say, with the policyholder, then it makes those companies more attractive from a reinsurance perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an interesting counterpoint to that as well, I think, which is the talent point of view. Probably worth an annual review. Might as well do it now, if not anywhere else. But you've seen a lot of that business as a really good case study move to MGAs. And you've seen a lot of really good people, meanwhile, moving from traditional carriers to MGAs at the same time. You know, more reward tied more closely to their performance. Arguably, I think has been a lot of the attraction of doing so there. But at the same time, especially in a very frothy market for M&A, you've seen a lot of senior underwriters, senior brokers, etc., put out of work quite quietly by consolidation, by lines of business being cut where, you know, over the last few years they haven't been deemed profitable, so they've just been sort of closed down. So as a talent pool, it feels like perhaps our market has reduced the amount of talent that it depends on, all at the same time as demand for our products increasing and, in theory, capital following at some point, but maybe not. Any thoughts on the outlook for talent in this space?
It means everyone gets paid more, right?
As long as you last, I suppose. It's like an elimination game. It's going to gradually become the Hunger Games of reinsurance.
That could be a good long-running feature for the podcast.
Yeah, no, it'll be an interesting one to watch. I think there's always been the sort of rise of startups, and as a result of this off the back. So talent will always ebb and flow between the big carriers, the consolidations, the new startups, consolidations, the people fall out. So I think one of the things that was a sort of trend in 2023, or a lack of a trend, was the lack of net new companies emerging following Ian, right? Which I think we're always looking at this comparison of looking at the previous massive events. So the spike of new classes of reinsurance coming in, cat bonds kind of filled a lot of that in this renewal season, but we hadn't seen the sort of net new entrants with a sort of influx of talent. Perhaps that's there. I think there's capital, PE capital, looking to sort of deploy and build businesses here. So certainly there's an opportunity for it, but I think that's a likely scenario, is more startup firms sort of getting in and picking up that talent that has an opportunity to sort of make it.
We haven't seen it on the reinsurer side, where there's probably been less in on the consolidation side amongst reinsurers as a result. Whereas where we really have seen a lot of new startups coming through has been on the broking side, where the consolidation has been, well, much more pronounced if you include a couple of the mega mergers that have happened in the last couple of years. So there are actually some really exciting, new startups. I don't want to shouldn't single anyone out, but like
Go
I
ahead.
have an eye on like Juniper Re seems like really interesting project, particularly with that being a proper US domiciled reinsurance broker. And there's a few others that are coming out that I think will get some traction.
Yeah, and it was interesting getting a few opinions on this when I was out in Bermuda, sort of mid-December. But live from the action,
That's a terrible time to be in Bermuda.
oh no, it's great though to get, from the battle lines on the front line, watching everything happen. It was good in that respect. The weather was terrible there, I must say. Yeah, no swimming in the sea, or in the pool for that matter. But anyway, the main thing that came out of the discussion about the brokers was whether we have enough brokers now. And actually, it seemed like most people thought we'd reached quite a nice point. There was definitely frustration previously, but now there's probably enough. In fact, some of them said probably 6 or 7 is enough. And then you have a few players around the edge that are your more specialty plays where there's a particular angle they're going after. And obviously, there's value to having those extra pieces around the edge because there's going to be consolidation in future years of those players. It's doubtful that the various acquisition machines that we see in the broking space are going to slow down their plans anytime soon. And of course, 2024 is very exciting for seeing what happens from a Willis point of view as well. So we'll all be watching with bated breath.
Well, yeah, I was going to say it. I mean, clearly the brokers don't agree that 6 or 7 brokers isn't like where was that opinion coming from?
That was more from the market's point of view and from the buyer's point of view, as in they feel like there's more choice now. I think as well we call it choice for buyers. It's every choice of a reinsurance broker is also pressure to adopt a reinsurance broker, right? I mean, some of the co-broking that goes on nowadays is a little bit silly in terms of the number of brokers you have on a given panel because you want to give a slice to everyone who's your friend.
So they're just fed up of being sold to? Or
I think there was a recognition that nobody wanted to be, especially when we were looking at a fear of Aon Willis happening prior to Willis Gallagher, where it's like, oh, if this goes through, 80% of my reinsurance deals are either being done by or coming through, two brokers effectively.
Yeah.
And that was a little bit scary in terms of power because, at that point, who can challenge them? Who can say what commissions are right, what rebates are right, because you've got no alternatives to point to. Whereas now there's a healthier balance, I would say, between being able to push back and say, actually, there are quite attractive other providers I can use. I'm probably still going to use you, but on good terms.
No, I just found it an interesting comment, like something that you use every day. You're like, okay, that's enough choice. Like, there's enough pens in the world. I don't need no more brands of pens.
I would agree with that comment.
No, I think when we were looking at, if you look at it from a reinsurer's point of view, the very obvious fear of there's only 2 is big because the power imbalance is so significant. However, it's fairly resource intensive to build relationships with brokers worldwide. And if you said instead of 2, we're going to have 500 different brokers, all of whom are going to do their own, that's a hellscape for reinsurers who are going to try to send their team to go on meetings and trips and build bigger relationships and have a strategy across shared clients and everything else. So I think they're trying to strike that balance of we don't want 2, we also don't want hundreds and hundreds, like because we need to deploy our efforts to build relationships and get the deal flow that we want. If that deal flow sort of explodes across hundreds of people, as an extreme example, that's also very difficult. So I think they're looking at it going, 7 to 10's about right. More than that's too painful. There's this sort of there's massive tangent now, but there was a report that come out. This is like early 2000s maybe, but it was about mustard and how like if there's too many options of mustard, people have like paralysis of choice. Similar here, I think, in reinsurance of like I only want a couple core ones. If you introduce like hundreds of variations of this, I'd just rather just walk away from the whole operation. Give me a couple select few that I know I can trust.
What are the core mustards?
No, so the comparison was why there's only a few. Because if you look at there's your American yellow.
Dijon a core mustard?
It is a core mustard. It is a core mustard.
Which variation of Dijon?
Yeah.
Coleman's.
Whole grain. whole grain Dijon.
Coleman's count.
What's the one that I can't pronounce? I probably can, but I've forgotten what it's called. There's a big French brand.
Yeah, they
got a
do the
store
whole grain, right?
They've got a store on Piccadilly, I think.
Oh, it's not great.
Yeah, where you can get like 18 different types.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Not all of those are core mustards.
No.
Oh, all core mustard.
Specialty mustard.
But if you go like the big grocers in the States will only have a couple versus
They're on a big yellow squeezy bottle.
French mustard.
Right. Horrendous. A yellow that does not appear in nature. That's the color we want for our mustard.
Yeah.
That's an excellent tangent. We've not had a
but
good tangent like that in ages.
But continuing on that thought, though, I'd be keen to expand the same conversation to the reinsurers at the moment, because, like you said, we've not had this influx of capacity. And the obvious conclusion that most people have drawn from that quite a long time ago was, even if they did come along, what difference would it make? If somebody sets up with $1 billion of capacity now, even if they went after those lower layers for some reason and wanted to tackle that gap in the market for the attritional risks, would it make any difference? Not that much. But I think somebody pointed out while we were chatting in Bermuda, this bigger issue for the longer term of the market, which was no Re of tomorrow is being born today. So we're sat in this position where succession planning almost for the world's largest reinsurers hasn't happened in the same way that it happened way back in 92, 93. You think about the amount of time that it takes and the initial impetus that's required to start growing a pool of reinsurers, of whom there's not many left. Most of them have been absorbed over time, but it does take a really long time to grow sizable capital vehicles that can stand up against or next to your big four Europeans, etc. I think maybe that's part of the challenge in getting them off the ground, has been like.
Do you think some of it's hindsight though? Because if you were there in the mid 90s and kind of that class of reinsurers as they were being born, they were set up as captives or shared pools of risk. We are seeing that today. We are seeing increased flow of capital and capacity into captive models, even shared captive models. And in the 90s, probably they just saw it as that. And then eventually they became full-fledged, standalone, full-stack reinsurers. I think the same thing is possible, but we don't have that hindsight.
Yeah, perhaps. I think definitely that feels like a more, subtle's the wrong word, but like a different way of building the scale without having to try and compete with the fully fledged offerings of the major reinsurers, right? Because I think going back to this diversification point and the ability to offer decent prices, part of the challenge, the barrier to entry for a new reinsurer is that if you're not providing this full suite of services, how are you able to offer a competitive price? You can't go in and say, well, we're just going to start with cat for now and just accumulate horrendous amounts of cat risk that's not offset with anything else. And likewise, you can't really do that.
Yeah.
In any other
specialty mustard become core mustard.
Yeah. Right.
You gotta find the right. Well, so
there needs to be a crisis somewhere where there's not enough mustard to fill that hot dog.
My fridge sometimes.
Yeah. No, I think the other thing that sort of might bump into this is the biggest challenge when you're setting up a new sort of capacity provider is access to deal flow, and alongside that, some element of diversification where it's like you can access deals but also not be overly exposed to a single event, which could be destructive. Where this might become really interesting is in these sort of fast follow or automated follow areas where people could come in, deploy capital, but inherently get a much sort of wider spread or diversification of that risk and grow that way. So I think in addition to not having the benefit of hindsight with the current model, I also think we're not looking forward enough with like how the environment in which they participate might also be evolving alongside their offering. Because you could make a claim that your access to new pools of risk, whether it's through deploying your capital through cat bonds or supporting, like getting on panels alongside partners like a Ren who does sort of helps deploy capital, opens up ways for you to put that capital to work in ways that may not have existed in the mid-90s. So I think it's a combination of those two things. Is people might be getting very, very creative around, we're going to raise and we're going to deploy it in this way, and this is going to help us build the model of tomorrow.
It's certainly very impressive how quickly Kin has grown, I would say, as a case study of this. I mean, I was a bit doubtful, if I'm honest, when this automated underwriting approach, I mean, the automated follow style was launched, as to whether it would get the buy-in, the traction, but Key has done really, really well as a syndicate. And
they're even getting support from like other partners in the market, right? So that people are joining them and sort of sharing that sort of model alongside, like what would have been competition in the previous model is now like, oh, we can all bundle together and get bigger sort of syndicated lines.
But I think
that's it. That's great for them because they're now seen as clear market leaders, and they've set all the benchmarks at Lloyd's, who do most of their regulation, around what's required of an algorithmic underwriting solution. And so that means that it's much, much cheaper, much, much easier if someone wants to do fast follow to just back Key rather than setting up their own thing. But it does stunt some of that like diversity that you say the market will need over time if that's the direction that the market goes in. And I think I think that's a question that this bit of the industry has been grappling with for a long time, is almost, what do you need first? Do you need the companies that adopt this model, or do you need the technology and the enablement for it first? I don't think anyone's quite worked that out.
Well, while we ponder that, maybe it's a good moment to talk about Lloyd's more generally, actually, because thinking about, just a few years ago, probably 3 years ago, Lloyd's was actually in a pretty worrying place in terms of how it was performing, years of poor results. It feels like the cards have turned over completely there. At the moment, coming off the back of a great year last year, looking like they're going to post fabulous results this year. Stamp capacity is coming out, 50 billion plus of business going out compared to, I remember when that was half of that. They really have grown quite impressively. At the same time, what I found really interesting is that their share actually of a lot of specialty business has declined a bit relative to the US markets, for example. They have a bit of room to grow, arguably, following the cutbacks when they decided, cutbacks is the wrong term, the decile 10, etc., when they were trying to improve performance more generally. It does feel like Lloyd's has been through a bit of a performance turnaround, alongside its culture turnaround, which is probably another topic for another time.
Well, rather than, I think it's quite easy to tell whether Lloyd's is going forwards or backwards, but the extent of that can actually be quite opaque because of the whole stamp capacity system. There's no other area of this industry that measures its appetite to risk in a written premium number. You would always measure that on an exposure basis. So it's never really made sense to me why Lloyd's decides that they're gonna reward good performers with being able to write more premium, whereas actually it should be, okay, we're going to reward good decision makers with being able to take on more exposure. And in market cycles, it becomes quite difficult to tell. Okay, well, is that increased stamp capacity because we're getting we're getting a higher premium for the same risk, or is that genuinely the market being able to take on more risk?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the recent growth in the market has been disguised somewhat by the level of inflation we've seen. I don't know, certainly there's been a lot of analysis to try and figure out what the actual numbers look like when you account for those additional factors, but certainly I probably had less attention given to inflation when it comes to premium growth and more attention when it comes to claims. So we probably need to keep the latter in mind, that we're probably going to face, as we have this year, quite a few more $100 billion plus insured claim years.
Yeah, but I think that the balance of attention that you just pointed out is aligned with reality. I think claims are inflating faster because it's like elements of like cost and materials and things are moving faster than clients are willing to pay, even if they had like the freedom to increase prices. I think clients would start going elsewhere, doing their own. Like I think there's
It certainly happens earlier.
Yeah.
I don't know about faster, but I think that's debatable. But earlier for sure, because claims cost. I mean, you have to buy a bit of wood, don't you, when the claim happens?
Yeah.
Right on that day, you have to wait until the following year to charge more premium.
Yep. Wait till renewals have hit, and you can. Yeah. So I think there is a bit of a lag there anyway. But I even think socially, I think people are willing to, and they're talking about the reforms on tort and things in Florida. Like there's also structurally where there's this sort of social inflation. People are pressing for, going door to door, asking people have had claims. Like there's this push to drive claims, which isn't, no one's going door to door like maybe they used to, but pushing for like, I don't know. You see, it's that lag and that sort of experience people feel is authentic, and I think the reason it gets covered in that way is people notice the pain they get from increased payments of claims, and the recognition that repairing something apples for apples this year versus what it would have cost to build it or repair it 2 or 3 or 5 years ago feels radically different, where I don't think you could say the same with premiums, except for those who've had like egregious price hikes on their renewals.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting topics, just diving into what you just said there, is with the reforms in Florida, suddenly we're potentially putting loads of lawyers who specialize in getting people to claim extensively for their insurance out of work. So suddenly you've got this small army of lawyers who used to live in Florida and make all their money from doing this type of business, and they're not allowed to do that largely anymore if these reforms continue to be effective. Where are they going to go now? Are they just going to go over the state boundary or find another state that's like had less effective controls? Or
It have to be one that's warm in the winter.
Yeah. So I think everyone's waiting to see, will they go somewhere else and do the same thing?
Yeah.
In a different region, or will they find some other way to make money out of the insurance world? We shall see.
It's the hellscape to see them just emerging like a little storm of briefcases into the wild.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? So, brief tangent on the ethics of finance.
Only better briefly tangent into the ethics of finance. Let's go.
So there's this long-term question about if you work in investment banking, hedge funds, etc., about whether you're adding value to society or not, or whether you're effectively just making money off society by arbitraging, prices between different markets, etc. And a greatly contested suggestion is that by doing what they do in investment banking, they're actually making markets more efficient. Could we argue that these lawyers are actually the unsung heroes of the insurance industry, making the insurance market more efficient by spotting, loopholes and issues with the way that coverage is procured and executed, and that actually their efforts have led to this reform to make our insurance market a more efficient and healthier place?
I think their efforts have directly led to the reform. So I think you could make that claim.
They're like activists.
Yeah.
They really care.
They're just champions of the people.
Yeah.
But transitioning back to the renewal season and the overview, I wanted to get sort of, Tom, your thoughts as to movement that we saw directly on our platform and software that our clients use, as it sort of provides a bit of a comparison or an overview of these reports that have come out, as well as sort of insider thoughts that we've seen from usage that we've gotten.
Yeah, talking to our clients, the brokers, largely they have a bigger view than us anyway. But what we saw anecdotally kind of largely followed what the big brokers have had. There was more variation than I was expecting between the brokers and their reports this year, which was interesting. But I think when we speak to individual clients, it largely followed the themes. The clients that focus very internationally, have a broad spread of risk, were finding things a little bit easier. Things were a bit more predictable. They knew where their capacity was coming from. There were fewer difficult conversations late into the renewal season. Like I said a bit earlier, companies that are in markets that have experienced big losses this year found things much more difficult. But even then, they knew it was going to be much more difficult in August, September, rather than having things sprung on them in November, like they did last year. So yeah, I agree. You know, what they call a new world, what a difference a year makes.
There's no ones that are officially out. This is just press releases from
Press
GC
releases
and
from GC and AM. Okay, all right. Well, you know, I think the titles kind of sum it up. You know, very different from last year. Or last year was very different to normal, and this is kind of a return to normalization. Some of those pressures were still there, though, right? It wasn't. We didn't see a situation where we spoke a lot last year about the additional questions that are being asked by reinsurers of cedents via their brokers, obviously. Those questions didn't go away. Those questions were still there. And so I think that added robustness and added due diligence that people were doing last year is probably here to stay, and will just become a standard part of the process. So it's going to be really important for cedents to be able to respond really quickly to a wide variety of questions and a deeper interrogation of what their numbers and the figures that they're presenting and the tables and charts that they're presenting really mean. Which means they're going to have to know the numbers better, and they're going to have to use, you know, methods of aggregation that allow them to manipulate and slice and dice and answer questions really easily. I don't think that's going away.
Yeah, well, I think that it circles back to this point of bifurcation where those, similar to how we have it with loss-affected and non-loss-affected programs, similarly, you'll see cedents who are able to turn around and have answers to these questions up front, getting sort of first cut of capacity, right? And if we're going to continue to sort of see people like more and more pull towards sort of best-in-class risk and away from sort of risk that feels more risky, those types of things will begin to have a increasing impact over time as reinsurers look to deploy capital into the types of risks that make the most sense and feel like they're going to get the best return on.
Do you think we saw a improvement in timeliness? I'm careful to introduce the topic of punctuality, given glass houses, but did we see people coming to market?
It depends on what aspect, right? I think last year people got prepped actually really early. And this year they probably got prepped around the same time. The thing is that everyone just sat on everything for a massive period of time, waiting to see what could be traded off against what. And there was, you know, that horse trading was still happening. Yeah,
that makes sense. I guess in the time that remains, it would be good to turn our spectacles, none of us are wearing them, turn our view towards 2024 and what we think is ahead or lies ahead for the year that we're looking at now. Similar trends, hardening, softening, jumping about all over the place. What do you see as the main topics that are going to come out over the next few months?
I think you'll see a stabilization still. I think sort of like a market-wide high level, I don't think you'll see rates dropping yet, but I think we've sort of pulled the Band-Aid off in 2023 where you're not going to see any sort of massive spikes, albeit from those maybe who had really bad loss-affected layers still. If you had, you know, if you're suffering from Turkish losses or you had a bunch of war exposure, like those programs will still be very, very difficult. But I think you'll see that, and I still also think that as reinsurers are sort of meeting their cost of capital for the first time in a while, I suspect you'll continue to see them continue to lean into that, trying to avoid layers that could erode or damage that performance and doubling down on parts of programs and layers and spots in the market that they feel can continue to benefit them there in this sort of short term. Whether that then balances out in another year or two's time, we'll see. But I think that's what we'll see in the short term from my perspective on it.
Yeah, I agree broadly. I think the US casualty story still has some legs to run on it, and we'll see that, you know, in quarterly results across the first half of the year, and that will have an impact. But otherwise, things, you know, you can see where the trends are, and it would take a huge surprise to change those at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we see probably as you hinted at with this recurring word of bifurcation, maybe that's going to be the word for the next year. We had a prior renewals where there was wholesale change, regardless of what line of business you were doing. Capital had changed its mind. Sorry, prices are going up. But now some of those macroeconomic events that we've seen affecting us, whether it's geopolitics, whether it's climate change, we're going into an El Nino this year, I believe, so that'll be interesting. But equally, some of the more general pressures from the results of inflation, interest rates, etc., we're probably going to see a more nuanced interpretation of how those are affecting individual classes and looking more closely at reserves and performance than we did in the previous couple of years. I know people have been looking at cyber capacity, people have been looking at motor claims in the US as some horrendous accident records emerging there, probably because everyone keeps watching Netflix on their phone whilst driving. Don't do it, it's a bad idea. But
this
also
car drives itself.
Yeah, it's that gap period between automated motor anyway. But as we do go into 2024, I do expect that we'll see more and more class-specific and region-specific adjustments being made against a more stable backdrop, I guess, as reinsurers decide what they want their portfolios to look like, and cedents decide how willing they are to continue writing portfolios that might not give them the rate they require.
Yeah. Well, and as much as our podcast is the absolute source of truth for all of these things, to Ben's point, the Howden renewal report dives into macroeconomic trends and inflationary pressures and tons of stuff. If you want to read a 71-page report and print it off and waste all of your printer's ink, it's actually an excellent read into all of those. Valued deployment of my printer's ink. But it dives into all of those nuances across all those various elements there. So really, really thorough, excellent work by Flandreau. That will be in the show notes. We'll also put the Gallagher one in the show notes as well, so people can access those very conveniently from our sites. So,
as we're sat here with Supercede's finest, or some of them, many other fine Supercede team members, of course, not currently on the show. How was the renewal from a Supercede perspective? Do you want to take that one?
It was excellent. Yeah, I know. I like the way that you asked me when you know full well how it went. But I'll go along with the ruse. Yeah. The renewal season went excellently. We put through over $60 billion in underlying premium this year, which is, we did 24 point something last year. So enormous growth in the throughput from it. A lot of that was in digitized submission packs, so over a 200% increase in the number of digital submissions that were made by cedents. So we're seeing huge growth in that. That's good adoption. Those are good growth numbers. We're seeing people are willing to go digital now, which is really encouraging. Our numbers are still only 1% of the market, probably, and so I don't think that move to digital is as wholesale as you'll believe if you read annual reports and things like that from insurance companies particularly. Actually, most of the user growth came from the reinsurer side. So we've now got nearly 200 reinsurance markets kind of live and using the platform and registering risks on it. So we can see that it's being adopted from that side. Lots more to do.
Yeah. No, it's super exciting. 2024 is going to be a big one for us and for the market as a whole. So off we go now into the new horizon.
Yeah. Happy New Year, everyone. Think of some good New Year's resolutions. I can suggest some that involve using Supercede if you're stuck for ideas.
Happy New Year, everyone.